first of all, let me start with a little bit of background on the museum. How many of you have heard of Dr. James Cameron? Okay, very good. And so you know he was the founder of America's Black Holocaust Museum. The museum actually opened in 1988. And in the early 1990s, it moved to what is now, or what was, 4th and North Avenue. Recently, 4th Street was named Bell R. Phillips Avenue, okay? So the new museum sits right on the footprint of kind of the original museum. So it opened in 1988, stayed open until 2008. Recession, a number of things caused the museum to close. But let me just back up a little bit. Some of you probably know that Dr. James Cameron was a survivor of an actual lynching. When he was 16 years old in Marion, Indiana, he almost was lynched. In fact, 2 of his friends actually were lynched. And if you read his memoir, his book, A Time of Terror, it will tell you that it was a horrific scene. And I guess during that time period, they called it a spectacle lynching, where people would come from miles and miles around. And it would be a festive occasion. There would be children there. There'd be laughter. There'd be food and all of that to witness the spectacle of most often young African men being brutalized and then hung. So as Dr. Cameron tells the story, the mob drug his 2 friends out of the jail first, and they were brutally beaten and lynched. Then the mob came back for him, and he was praying because he knew that this was pretty much it for him. So they beat him on the way to where they were going to lynch him on the tree. As the mob was all fired up and excited, and there was all of this commotion going on, they put the noose around his neck. And then all of a sudden, out of all of this commotion, there was kind of like a quiet, calming voice that said something to the effect, "Leave that boy alone. He did not do anything." And he said it was, like a miracle. And I think it was divine intervention. He said, amidst all of the commotion and all of the frenzy, it's almost like the crowd got calm. They took the noose off of his neck, and then they guided him back to the jail. And so he survived that lynching. So after that, he spent a couple of years in jail. When he got out of jail, he began to write about his experiences. He began to collect historical data, do research. But it was not until the late 1970s that he and his wife had an opportunity to go on a church pilgrimage to Israel. They went to Jerusalem. And while they were there, he had a chance to see the Jewish Holocaust Museum. That museum had a profound impact on him and his wife. And as the story goes, they spent their time in the museum actually crying because of the, inhumanity that had been inflicted on many people of the Jewish faith. And in particular, there was the section in the museum that had hundreds, if not thousands, of pairs of shoes of all of the children who had been murdered and who had been gassed. Again, it had a profound impact on Dr. Cameron. And he said at that moment to his wife, we need a Black Holocaust Museum in America to tell the story of Black people's experience in America. So that was kind of the origin of him thinking about creating a museum. So as he got back, he started to work on the museum. And like many small people that don't have a lot of resources, he started out of his basement, out of his garage, until he was finally able to get some storefronts, and then finally able to open the museum at then 4th and North, which is now Bell Phillips and North. Okay? And as I said before, the museum opened in 1988, stayed open to 2008. Unfortunately, Dr. Cameron passed away in 2006. So just 2 years after he passed away, the museum closed. Almost immediately after the museum closed, there was a core group of people that sat down and said, we have to reopen this museum. We have to figure out a way to preserve Dr. Cameron's dream and his legacy. And the museum is extremely important, not only to the African American community, but to our total community, because it talks about a very vivid and sometimes painful part of our history. But you know what? I really believe that in order for us to have healing and reconciliation and to be able to move forward together, we have to know about, we have to learn from, we have to confront our past. Okay, so these group of people, and it was a number of people, but I'm going to mention 3 people in particular. Brad Pruitt, who is our current interim director, Dr. Fran Kaplan, who is an educator and researcher, and Reggie Jackson. Some of you may have heard of Reggie Jackson because he is our head griot. That's our primary storyteller for the museum. They were relentless in their efforts to try and bring this museum back. And one of the things that Dr. Kaplan did, she had the vision, I'm going to say somewhere around 2012, to create a virtual museum. The virtual museum exists today. And she felt that while we were trying to bring back the physical museum, you could have a virtual museum where people could go on site and visit the museum. The virtual museum has over 3,000 pages of content. Millions of people visit the site from over 200 countries around the world. So the virtual museum is, I think it exceeded even Dr. Kaplan's wildest expectations. So our museum is not only a local, national, but it's an international museum. And let me just digress and say, one of the things that we have been doing as we're trying to bring the museum back, we've been talking with and working with Visit Milwaukee. You know, that's the arm that markets Milwaukee and brings visitors and guests here. One of the things that they want to do when we're ready is incorporate America's Black Holocaust Museum in all of their marketing material so that as they try to attract visitors and tourists to Milwaukee, they will know that we have one of the most unique, cultural institutions, in the nation. So, and we're, quite excited about that. All right. So, as people were struggling, trying to bring this museum back, and if any of you have ever been involved in a construction project or major remodeling project, you know it's costly and it's not easy. So, one of the things that happened to the museum that helped to bring us to where we are now, we developed a partnership with Melissa Goins. Now, I don't know how many of you know her, but she is a young African-American developer. And she developed the complex right at Bell Phillips and North Avenue. It's called the Griot Apartments. And it also includes the old Garfield Avenue Elementary School, which was at then 4th and Garfield. And she developed that and built the new buildings. And where the museum sits right on the corner, and I keep saying 4th and North, but it's Bell Phillips. But right on the corner of 4th and North, there are some apartments above the museum, and the museum, which is about 6,000 to 8,000 square feet of space, occupies the first floor. Had it not been for Melissa Goins doing this major development, I dare say we would not be where we are now with bringing this important museum back. So, where are we today? Today, we are in the process of installing our exhibits, and we have made some very substantial progress. And I would just be very candid, since we're a small, intimate group here. Part of our frustration is we're behind schedule. We had really, sound familiar, right? We had really wanted to be open in 2018. But because of a variety of things, and again, if you've been involved in construction projects, building projects, you know things don't always go according to plan. But we're working very hard now to open the museum as soon as we possibly can. And one of the questions that I get more often than not is, Ralph, when is the museum going to open? Tell me the date. When is the museum going to open? And I've had to be a little wishy-washy because we kind of announced some dates in 2018, and they've come and gone, and we're in 2019. Who can believe it's February, okay? So what we've decided to do is not put another hard date out there, because there's so many things we can't control. So when we put another date out there, we want to be absolutely certain that we can open on that date. Because to be honest about it, if you keep moving the goalpost, as they say, what's going to happen? You lose your credibility. So, again, not to, drawn on and on about this, but I thought it was important for you guys to know, kind of where we are and how we're proceeding. Now, some of the exhibits, and I won't try to list them all, but just to give you a thumbnail sketch. The first exhibit that you're going to see when you visit the museum is an exhibit regarding what we call pre-captivity. Prior to black people, Africans, being brought to America as slaves, we wanted to go back to the African continent and, just kind of give a glimpse of what life was like in Africa prior to people being brought to America. And if any of you have done some of your African history, you know that there were parts of Africa that were rural, but there were other parts that were advanced civilizations. In some respects, historians say that Africa was the cradle of civilization. And there's a city called Timbuktu. I don't know how many of you have heard of Timbuktu. It was an advanced city, and this is what the historians say, this is not Ralph. While some of our European brothers were still living in caves, Timbuktu was an advanced civilization with an advanced culture, mathematics, and all sorts of things. So the museum wants to start off with that. Then we want to talk about the period when Africans were first brought to America as slaves. Now, it's real interesting. This year is the 400th year commemoration of when the first documented Africans were brought to America as slaves back in 1619. And, to digress, there are going to be a number of organizations, including America's Black Holocaust Museum, that are going to be having events, programs, and activities throughout the year to, commemorate this historic event. And I would just say, and I'm going to repeat this later on, I would just say that in order to get more information currently about the museum, some of its history, and to learn about some of our future events and programs, we would encourage people to visit our website, abhmuseum.org. ABH Museum, and I'm going to repeat that again, abhmuseum.org. And the interesting thing is people have said a lot of people may never come to your physical museum, but they will visit your website because they can do that in their pajamas. So I would definitely encourage people, to take the opportunity, at your leisure when you have some time to do that. So pre-captivity, the next exhibit is going to be talking about slavery and the whole Middle Passage and how Africans were treated or mistreated, I should say, especially when they were crammed into the bottom of slave ships. And as the story goes, some Africans were captured inland, and they had to make a grueling trek, a grueling walk to the coast where they could get on the slave ships to come to America. Many of the Africans did not survive that grueling trek. So that was the first, genocide, if you will. And then people were crammed into the bottoms of these ships and then brought over to America. Well, as you can imagine, many did not survive that arduous boat trip, and they were unceremoniously buried at sea, just tossed over, okay? So those people who survived the rigors of getting to America, they had to be strong, resilient people to survive that kind of atrocity, okay? And the museum, painful as it is, wants to let people know about that. We have to be educated about that period of time, okay? So after the beginning of slavery, then there are exhibits talking about Jim Crow. This is the period after slavery was supposedly abolished, and then how Africans were, or African Americans were treated in America, primarily in the South, after slavery had ended. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but just suffice it to say that in the Jim Crow era, African Americans were not treated much better than during slavery time, okay? Then there are exhibits that talk about the civil rights movement, which, kind of happened after the Jim Crow period. So we talk about, civil rights and some of the civil rights leaders. And not only, Dr. Martin Luther King, which everybody knows, but some lesser known civil rights advocates and civil rights heroes. Then there's an exhibit that focuses on Milwaukee, what was happening in Milwaukee. And in particular, it focuses on the late 1960s when Vel Phillips was advocating for open housing in Milwaukee. And I think many of you remember that for like 200 days, Father Grappi, Vel Phillips, the Commandos, the NAACP Youth Council marched until we finally got an open housing ordinance passed in Milwaukee. And I should say that the efforts here locally in Milwaukee had a significant impact on the passing of an open housing legislation at the federal level. So the museum tries to explore that. And finally, without trying to name everything, there are going to be exhibits that talk about current day. What is happening today? You have Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, all of these things that are taking place today. They're going to be exhibits that talk about that. And one of the things that we really want to try to do is we want the museum to be current and vibrant. So in other words, yes, there's set pieces of history, but current day events are going to change. What's current today may not be current a year or two from now. So that's how the museum is going to stay relevant, by always having an exhibit that talks about current day events. And so as I, begin to close a little bit so that we have time for, some dialogue back and forth, let me just say that we want this museum to not only be a museum where people can come in and look at the exhibits and look at history. We want this to be an educational institution. We want to reach out to schools, high schools, colleges, to young people, to the broadest cross-section of the community. Because again, as I said earlier, in order for us to have healing and reconciliation, we have to know about our history, even though parts of it were somewhat painful and somewhat unpleasant.